Ferrari wins a huge technical battle against Mercedes. The FIA plans on making F1 cars 4 seconds faster after engine changes, and Hamilton has been tipped to lead Ferrari back to winning ways. Let's get into the latest F1 news. Lewis Hamilton walked into Ferrari's garage for the first time as a factory driver, and something shifted. Not just for him, but for the entire Formula One landscape. Because what we've been watching unfold through the first half of 2026 is not just a driver changing teams. It's a resurrection story, and today we are going to break down exactly why it's happening, what's driving it technically, and what it means for the championship fight ahead. Stick around because by the end of this video, you're going to understand Hamilton's transformation at Ferrari in a way that most coverage completely misses. We are going deeper than the lap times and the podiums. We are talking about the engineering philosophy, the human factors, and the specific technical changes that have unlocked something in Lewis that honestly, many people thought might be gone forever. Let me set the scene first. When Hamilton announced he was leaving Mercedes after over a decade, the reaction was divided. Some people saw it as a bold move by a living legend chasing one more championship. Others saw it as a desperate gamble, a driver past his prime trying to find a spark. The skeptics had reasonable ground to stand on. His final season at Mercedes in 2025 was difficult. The car was uncompetitive in patches, the relationship with the team felt strained, and there were moments where the sheer hunger that defines Hamilton seemed dulled. But here we are in the summer of 2026, and that narrative is completely shattered. So what actually changed? Let's start with the technical foundation, because this is where the story begins and where most people stop paying attention. Ferrari came into 2026 with what many engineers privately considered their most ambitious chassis concept in years. The new regulations that came into force this season fundamentally changed how downforce is generated, with a massive shift toward active aerodynamic systems and revised underbody regulations. Ferrari's interpretation of these rules produced a car with a very specific character. It loves a driver who can feel the rear of the car with extreme precision, who is willing to rotate the car aggressively into corners, and who can manage a somewhat nervous balance through high-speed sequences. Now, here is where the human element becomes inseparable from the technical one. Hamilton has always been, at his absolute best, a driver who drives through feel. Not a data-driven robot, not someone who simply executes a predetermined strategy lap after lap. He reads the car through his hands and his body, makes micro-adjustments constantly, and when the car communicates with him correctly, the results are extraordinary. The problem at Mercedes over the last couple of years was precisely that the communication broke down. The car was giving him confusing signals. The balance was inconsistent. He could not trust what he was feeling. Ferrari's 2026 chassis restored that conversation. The specific aerodynamic concept Ferrari developed creates what the engineers are calling a more consistent front-to-rear balance window. What that means in plain language is that the car behaves more predictably across different fuel loads, different tire compounds, and different track temperatures. For a driver like Hamilton who relies on feel, predictability is not a limitation. It's a gift. It means the feedback he gets on lap 1 of a stint is the feedback that remains relevant on lap 20. There's another layer here that goes beyond pure aerodynamics. Ferrari made significant strides in their suspension philosophy for 2026. The passive mechanical setup was reworked to better interface with the active aero systems, and the result is a car that absorbs curbs and surface irregularities in a way that keeps the chassis attitude more stable. Hamilton is famously sensitive to how a car rides over bumps. When the rear gets unsettled by a curb mid-corner and the car starts moving in directions the driver didn't input, it destroys confidence. Ferrari eliminated a huge portion of that problem. Now let's talk about the human side, because the technical story only exists within the human context. Hamilton arrived at Maranello in January with something to prove, but also with a level of self-awareness that perhaps he didn't have in earlier chapters of his career. He was open in pre-season interviews about the mental reset he underwent during the off-season. He spoke about returning to basics, about reconnecting with why he actually loves driving racing cars rather than the external noise of championships and legacies and records. What that translated to in practical terms was a driver who was genuinely curious again. Former Ferrari engineers and mechanics who have spoken to various media outlets describe his integration process as remarkably smooth for someone arriving with such an enormous reputation. He wasn't the guy who needed everything done his way from day one. He listened. He asked questions. He put in hours in the simulator not just to understand the car, but to understand how Ferrari thinks about car setup and race engineering as a discipline. That humility, combined with genuine talent, created an environment where Ferrari's engineers wanted to give him more. It became collaborative in the truest sense. His race engineer at Ferrari built a communication style with him that prioritizes qualitative feedback over purely numerical data, which is exactly what Hamilton has historically responded to best. And then there's the Scuderia factor itself. Ferrari as an organization has a specific kind of pressure, the weight of Italian motorsport history, the tifosi, the expectation of performance. Some drivers crack under that pressure. Others, and this is the fascinating part, are elevated by it. Hamilton appears to be in the second category. He has spoken about feeling a sense of purpose within Ferrari that reinvigorated his competitive instincts. The pressure isn't suffocating him. It's fueling him. Let's bring this back to the track now and look at some specific evidence of the transformation. The opening races of 2026 told an interesting story. Hamilton was clearly still learning the car, still finding the limits, but even in those early rounds there were flashes of something special. His tyre management, always one of his great strengths, was immediately visible. Ferrari's 2026 car has a tendency to generate front tyre heat quickly under certain conditions, and Hamilton's ability to modulate his entry speed and steering inputs to protect the front tyre compound gave Ferrari a strategic flexibility they had not always had with their previous driver lineups in recent seasons. By the middle portion of the season, the learning curve had steepened into something more like a vertical line upward. Hamilton was not just matching expectations. He was surpassing them. The qualifying pace, which had been one of the areas where critics suggested age and circumstance might have eroded his edge, returned in a way that silenced most doubters. His single lap ability in particular seemed to benefit from a specific characteristic of Ferrari's power unit deployment system in 2026, which delivers its hybrid power in a smoother, more linear fashion than what Mercedes was producing in his final seasons there. For context on why that matters, consider that Hamilton's driving style involves very precise throttle application on corner exit. When a power unit delivers energy in unpredictable surges, the rear of the car steps out in ways that either compromise the exit or force a more conservative approach. Ferrari's smoother deployment meant Hamilton could be more aggressive on exit without the risk of a snap oversteer moment. That directly contributed to improved sector 3 times, particularly on circuits with slow to medium speed corners feeding onto long straights. There's a conversation happening in Formula One paddock circles about whether this Hamilton performance is sustainable or whether it represents a peak that will eventually recede. Let me give you both sides of that argument fairly. The skeptic's position is this: Hamilton is in his 40s. No matter how talented, no matter how motivated, there are physiological realities that cannot be ignored forever. Reaction times, physical recovery between sessions, the demands of a modern Formula One car's physical requirements, these factors accumulate over time. The skeptics argue that what we are seeing is a motivated surge, a honeymoon period with a new team and a new car, and that as the season's second half unfolds and the pressure intensifies, the cracks may reappear. The believer's position is equally compelling. Hamilton has always defied standard aging curves in motorsport. His physical condition is exceptional by any measure, the result of years of disciplined training and lifestyle management. His intelligence as a driver means he compensates for any minor physical diminishments with strategic and technical sophistication that younger drivers simply haven't developed yet. And critically, the technical fit between Hamilton and this specific Ferrari is so strong that the conditions are genuinely optimal in a way that hasn't existed for him in several years. My red. The truth likely lives somewhere between those two positions, but it leans toward the believer's camp for one specific reason: the consistency. When a driver is on a motivated surge that isn't backed by genuine underlying performance, you see variance. Great drives followed by puzzling off days. What Hamilton has shown at Ferrari is remarkable consistency in his baseline performance, and that consistency is the hallmark of a driver who has found his home in the car rather than a driver forcing results through sheer willpower. Now let's zoom out a little and talk about what this means for the championship picture. Ferrari entered 2026 as genuine title contenders, but the consensus before the season was that their main threat would come from their other driver rather than from Hamilton in his debut season with the team. That script has been torn up. Hamilton is firmly in the title conversation, and that has created a fascinating internal dynamic at Ferrari that the team is managing carefully and, so far, effectively. The competition for the Constructors' Championship is also deeply influenced by Hamilton's contribution. A Ferrari with two genuine frontrunners produces strategic options that a Ferrari with one clear leader simply cannot match. The double stacking strategies, the ability to react to safety cars differently depending on which driver is in which position, the psychological pressure it puts on rival teams who have to manage their responses to two separate threats simultaneously, all of this compounds Ferrari's competitive advantage. From a technical standpoint, Hamilton's detailed feedback is also accelerating Ferrari's development program. He articulates subtle balance issues with the kind of precision that gives engineers high-quality data to work with. There are reports from within the team that several mid-season updates were developed more quickly and with greater confidence than previous years because the quality of driver feedback drove the simulation work in clearer directions. Let me address something that doesn't get enough attention in mainstream coverage: the mental health dimension of this story. Hamilton has been publicly open about the personal struggles he navigated in recent years. The demands of being a global icon, the weight of representing something larger than just motorsport, the complicated feelings around his final championship battle and its infamous conclusion in 2021, these things left marks. What's less discussed is how those experiences ultimately contributed to a kind of emotional maturity and self-knowledge that is now visible in how he operates as a professional. He arrived at Ferrari not as a wounded champion needing validation, but as a complete person who had done the work on himself and was ready to apply that version of himself to a new challenge. That psychological completeness is genuinely rare in elite sport at any age. It's the difference between a driver who needs the car to be perfect to perform, and a driver who can extract extraordinary performance even on imperfect days because their internal foundation is solid. Ferrari, for their part, built an environment that nurtured this. The leadership understood that what they were getting was not just Hamilton the racing driver, but Hamilton the complete professional. They gave him involvement in car development discussions that went beyond the typical driver brief. They made him feel genuinely valued as a mind within the organization, not simply as a famous name on the entry list. The combination of technical excellence, personal evolution, organizational support, and sheer competitive intelligence has produced something that the sport hasn't seen in quite this configuration before. A champion who found a second wind, not through desperation, but through deliberate, thoughtful reinvention. What happens next is the genuinely fascinating question. The second half of the season will test everything. The circuits that remain on the calendar include some that historically have not suited Ferrari's philosophy, as well as the early season venues. The teams chasing them down will bring updates specifically targeted at the areas where Ferrari have been strongest. And the internal pressure at Ferrari will only intensify as the championship gap tightens or extends. Hamilton will face qualifying sessions where the margin between pole and third place is measured in hundredths of a second. He will face races where strategy calls go wrong and he needs to recover positions through pure driving craft. He will face mechanical unreliability, safety car restarts where split-second decisions determine positions, and the inevitable moments of bad luck that visit every driver through a season. How he handles those moments will be the ultimate measure of whether this renaissance is real or illusory. Based on everything we've seen so far, based on the technical foundation, the personal evolution, and the organizational alignment that has come together at Ferrari, I think the answer is clear. This is real. This is not a story about nostalgia or sentiment. This is about a generational talent who found the right conditions at exactly the right moment, and who had the wisdom and humility to recognize it and seize it. That is genuinely rare in sport. Usually great champions fade, and the fading is what we remember. We remember the last fights that don't quite happen, the performances that fall slightly short of former glories, the sad final chapters that precede retirement announcements. Hamilton is writing a different kind of ending. Or maybe not an ending at all. Maybe just a new chapter. And that is the most compelling story in Formula One right now. Not the technical specifications, not the lap time comparisons, not the championship points, though all of those are part of it. The story is about what's possible when a great talent refuses to accept the narrative that others write for them and instead creates their own. If you've been sleeping on the 2026 Formula One season thinking it was just more of the same, let this be your wake-up call. Something genuinely special is happening, and Lewis Hamilton is right at the center of it. If you want to go deeper on any aspect of this, the technical regulations, the championship standings, or the specific circuits coming up that will define this title fight, let me know in the comments. I read every single one. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now is the time. Because the rest of this season is going to be extraordinary, and you do not want to miss a second of it. Formula One never sleeps, and right now, Ferrari is making moves that could completely reshape the second half of this 2026 season. If you've been following the championship battle, you already know things have been incredibly tight. But what's coming out of Maranello right now has the entire paddock talking. Stay with me because by the end of this video, you're going to understand exactly why the next few races could be a defining moment for the Scuderia. So let's set the scene. The Austrian Grand Prix weekend is approaching, and Ferrari has arrived with something significant tucked under their sleeve. We are talking about a new power unit, a fresh specification of their engine package, and the timing of this introduction is absolutely fascinating. This isn't just a routine update or a minor tweak to the existing setup. According to sources close to the team, this new power unit represents a meaningful step forward in terms of performance, and that matters enormously given how competitive the field has become in 2026. Now, before we get into the details, let me just quickly explain why power unit updates are such a big deal in Formula One, especially in 2026. The regulations that came into force this season completely transformed the engineering landscape. Teams are running hybrid systems with a significantly higher electrical output contribution than we've ever seen before, which means the relationship between the internal combustion engine and the electrical deployment systems is more complex and more critical than at any point in the sport's history. When a team introduces a new power unit specification, they're not just changing one component. They're recalibrating an entire ecosystem of performance. So when Ferrari says they're bringing a new unit to Austria, that's genuinely significant news. Let me break down what we actually know. Ferrari's chief race engineer and technical management have confirmed that the Scuderia will deploy this new power unit specification at the Red Bull Ring. The circuit in Austria has some characteristics that make it particularly interesting for evaluating raw power output. It's a relatively short lap, meaning you complete more laps during a race distance than at somewhere like Spa or Silverstone. But don't let the lap time fool you. The Red Bull Ring demands serious horsepower because of its combination of long full throttle sections and those punishing elevation changes. Power is exposed there in a way that it isn't at more technical venues. The hope within Ferrari is that this new specification closes a gap that has been quietly frustrating the team throughout the early part of the season. Ferrari has been genuinely competitive on chassis terms. The car handles well, it's kind to its tires, and the drivers have extracted excellent lap times in qualifying at multiple venues. But there have been moments during races where the power delivery and outright top-end grunt just hasn't quite matched what some rivals have managed to produce. That gap, even if it sounds small in absolute terms, translates directly into overtaking opportunities lost and defensive positions that become untenable. Now here's where it gets really interesting, and this is the kind of detail that separates a good story from a great one. The introduction of this new power unit also coincides with discussions around their junior driver program and what happens next for some of their academy talents. Ferrari has been extraordinarily deliberate over the past couple of seasons about how they develop their young drivers, and right now the name Dino Beganovic keeps coming up in those conversations. If you haven't been paying attention to Beganovic, let me fill you in because this young man is genuinely special. Dino Beganovic is a Swedish driver of Bosnian heritage who has been climbing through the motorsport ladder with Ferrari's backing for several years now. He's been racing in Formula 2, and the performances have been impressive enough that the conversation around his future has shifted from potential to probability. The question is no longer whether Beganovic will eventually reach Formula 1. The question is when, and under what circumstances. And those circumstances are being shaped right now during this very period in the season. Ferrari management has been evaluating their options carefully, balancing the needs of the current championship campaign with the long-term strategic picture of driver development. In Formula One, you can't just plug in a promising youngster without consequences. The timing has to align with car competitiveness, team stability, and the broader regulatory environment. With 2026 representing such a fundamental reset of the technical regulations, teams that get their driver lineup right over the next 12 to 18 months could be setting themselves up for a multi-year dominance window. This is the context in which Beganovic's name keeps surfacing. Ferrari believes in him. The data from his junior category performances supports that belief. And the new power unit being introduced in Austria is part of a wider picture of Ferrari doing everything possible to ensure that when the right moment comes for major decisions, the tools are in place to make the most of them. Let's talk about the Red Bull Ring itself for a moment, because the venue adds another layer of narrative complexity to this story. Austria is Red Bull's home race, and the energy around the circuit is always unique because of that. The grandstands are packed with orange-clad Max Verstappen fans, but Ferrari's passionate supporters also make their presence felt in enormous numbers. There's a tribal atmosphere at the Red Bull Ring that doesn't quite exist anywhere else on the calendar, and it makes every session feel electric. For Ferrari to choose this specific venue to introduce a significant new power unit is a statement of intent. It says, "We are coming here, on your territory, with our best weapons." Whether or not the new unit delivers an immediate and obvious performance advantage remains to be seen, of course. Power unit introductions don't always produce instant lap time improvements because the integration process is complex, and teams often need a few races to fully optimize the settings and deployment strategies. But the direction of travel is clear, and that matters psychologically as much as it does technically. Now let's think about this from the perspective of the championship mathematics, because that context is everything. The midpoint of the season is approaching, and the standings are tight enough that every race from here until the summer break could swing things dramatically. Ferrari need results, not just good performances. There's a difference between a team that's quick but unlucky and a team that converts its pace into points consistently. The new power unit is targeted at bridging any remaining gap in outright performance so that the car on track reflects the full potential of the engineering package behind it. The drivers carrying these hopes for Ferrari are under enormous pressure, but pressure in Formula One is something the top performers thrive on. The internal atmosphere at Ferrari this season has been described by various insiders as focused and determined rather than tense or anxious. That distinction matters. A team that's scared of failure makes defensive decisions. A team that's hungry for success makes bold ones. Introducing a new power unit at Austria, rather than waiting for a quote-unquote safer venue, suggests the bold mindset is the one that's prevailing in Maranello right now. Let's zoom out for a second and consider the broader competitive picture. Ferrari is not the only team introducing upgrades at this stage of the season. Every major constructor is in a constant arms race, and the development cycle in 2026 has been particularly intense because the new regulations created so much uncertainty at the beginning of the year. Teams that started conservatively have been catching up, and teams that gambled on early development directions have sometimes had to course-correct significantly. Ferrari's approach has generally been methodical and data-driven, building confidence in their baseline before introducing major changes. The new power unit fits that pattern. This isn't a panic move. This is the delivery of a development step that has been planned and validated over many months of work at the factory. The engine department at Ferrari, based in Maranello, has one of the deepest pools of engineering talent in the sport. They know what they're doing, and when they say a new specification is ready for race deployment, there's a thorough process that stands behind that statement. What makes this particularly fascinating from a technical standpoint is the integration challenge. In 2026, the power unit regulations require much tighter coordination between the combustion engine and the electrical systems than ever before. The way energy is harvested under braking, stored, and then deployed during acceleration phases is extraordinarily complex, and different circuits demand different approaches to that energy management. Austria's layout means the energy cycles happen more frequently per lap than at a long circuit, which places specific demands on the hybrid system's thermal management and battery performance. If Ferrari's new unit handles those demands more efficiently, the gains could show up in ways that are difficult to quantify on a straightforward dyno test but very visible on race day. There's also the reliability dimension to consider. In Formula One, a fast engine that breaks down is worse than a slightly slower engine that finishes races. Every power unit introduction carries some degree of risk because you're dealing with components that have completed validation testing but haven't yet been exposed to the full brutality of a race weekend with all its unpredictable variables. The temperature ranges at the Red Bull Ring, the altitude effects on aerodynamic and cooling performance, the race pace demands over the full distance, these all represent unknowns that theory and simulation can approximate but never fully predict. Ferrari's engineers will be watching the temperature telemetry extremely carefully during every session in Austria. This brings us back to Dino Beganovic and why his story is intertwined with this moment. One of the things Ferrari Academy drivers do during race weekends is work closely with the engineering team, not just in the simulator but in absorbing the thought processes and decision-making frameworks that define how a top team operates. Beganovic has been doing exactly that, building his understanding of Ferrari's systems and culture so that if and when the call comes, the transition will be as seamless as possible. A driver who understands the power unit characteristics, who has lived through the introduction of new specifications and seen how engineers respond to them, is a driver who's going to be far better prepared for the demands of Formula One. The academy structure that Ferrari has built over the past decade is genuinely impressive. It doesn't just identify talent. It shapes talent into something specifically compatible with Ferrari's way of working. Beganovic, going through this period of intensive preparation, right as the senior team introduces a significant technical step, is part of that deliberate process of alignment. Let's talk about what the realistic expectations should be heading into Austria. Nobody at Ferrari is going to come out and say this new power unit will win us the race. That's not how professional motorsport works. The language will be measured, the expectations managed publicly even if privately the ambitions are high. What we should look for is whether Ferrari is genuinely in the fight throughout the race, not just in qualifying. Qualifying pace can flatter a car in ways that race pace cannot sustain. If Ferrari can match their Saturday performance with a Sunday showing that proves the new power unit is delivering real-world gains, that's the validation the team needs before building further confidence. The Red Bull Ring typically produces close racing, unpredictable strategy battles, and moments where raw power and corner exit traction separate the contenders from the pretenders. Ferrari needs to be firmly in the contenders category from the first session to the last. The new power unit is their best argument for being exactly that. One more element worth discussing is the psychological dimension of rival teams watching Ferrari introduce this new specification. In Formula One, information travels fast. The teams around you are constantly monitoring your development trajectory, and when Ferrari announces a new power unit, every other constructor's technical director is immediately asking their own engineers what it means for the competitive order. That intelligence gathering is a constant background process, and sometimes the knowledge that a rival has taken a step forward prompts an acceleration of one's own development timeline. In that sense, Ferrari's announcement is doing work even before the engines fire up for the first practice session. The 2026 season has been one of adaptation and discovery for everyone in the paddock. The regulations are genuinely new, genuinely challenging, and genuinely rewarding for the teams that crack their secrets first. Ferrari's combination of a new power unit, a competitive chassis, talented drivers, and a developing junior talent like Bogdanovic in the wings suggests an organization that is thinking about the present and the future simultaneously. That dual focus is very often what separates truly great teams from good ones. As we head into the Austrian Grand Prix weekend, the questions are fascinating. Will the new power unit deliver the performance gains Ferrari is hoping for? Will Bogdanovic continue his impressive trajectory and bring himself one step closer to a Formula One seat? And can Ferrari use this moment at the Red Bull Ring to send a message about their championship intentions in the second half of the season? I'll be watching every session very closely, and I'd encourage you to do the same, because this could be one of those weekends that we look back on as genuinely significant in the narrative of this season. Formula One history is made at specific moments, on specific weekends, when preparation meets opportunity. Ferrari has done the preparation. Austria is the opportunity. If you enjoyed this breakdown and want to stay ahead of everything happening in Formula One through the rest of 2026, hit that subscribe button right now and make sure you've got notifications turned on. I drop detailed analysis like this before every major race weekend, and trust me, you do not want to be the person showing up to the conversation without having done your homework. Also, let me know in the comments what you think about Ferrari's chances in Austria. Do you believe this new power unit is the piece they've been missing? Or is the challenge deeper than a single upgrade can solve? The discussion down there is always incredible. I'll see you in the next one. What if I told you that Formula One is about to go through one of the most dramatic engine revolutions in the sport's entire history, and this time it involves bringing back something fans have been begging to hear again for over a decade? We are talking about the return of the V8. But here's the twist, it's not exactly the V8 you remember, and the road to get there is way more complicated than anyone initially let on. Stick with me because by the end of this video, you'll understand exactly why the FIA just made a decision that could change the sound, the soul, and the future of Formula One forever. Let me set the scene for you. It's 2026, and Formula One is already deep into its current power unit era. The hybrid turbo V6 engines have been powering the grid since 2014, and while they're genuinely remarkable pieces of engineering, let's be honest, a huge portion of the fanbase has never fully forgiven the sport for abandoning those screaming naturally aspirated V8s that defined an entire generation of racing. And now, the FIA World Motorsport Council has been sitting in rooms debating what comes after the 2026 power unit regulations. What they've come up with is fascinating, controversial, and absolutely worth your full attention. So let's start with the basics. The FIA has been developing a framework for the 2027 and 2028 transitional period, and beyond that, looking at what a genuinely sustainable, genuinely exciting power unit might look like for the sport's future. And sitting right at the heart of that conversation is a revised engine concept that draws heavily on V8 architecture. But before we get into the juicy technical details, I need to give you a bit of context about why this is happening right now. The 2026 regulations brought in a completely new power unit format. More electrical power, a simplified MGU system compared to the previous era, and a strong commitment to using sustainable fuels. That last point is crucial because the entire philosophy shift going on inside Formula One's governance right now is that the sport cannot just keep making the same internal combustion decisions it's always made. There has to be a genuine environmental story being told. And sustainable fuels, which are essentially carbon-neutral fuels made from biological or synthetic sources, are a massive part of that story. Here's where it gets genuinely interesting. One of the big revelations coming out of discussions around the 2027 and 2028 engine framework is that the FIA has been seriously evaluating a V8 configuration running on these sustainable fuels. Now think about what that actually means. You would theoretically get an engine that sounds more like the golden era of Formula One, that revs higher, that has a more visceral character, but that is also running on fuel that produces significantly lower net carbon emissions than conventional fossil fuels. That is an extraordinary combination if it can be made to work properly. And that is the key question. Can it work properly? Because sustainable fuels present their own engineering challenges. They burn differently. They have different energy densities. They interact with engine components in ways that require significant re-engineering. It's not as simple as just pumping eco-friendly fuel into an existing engine and calling it a day. The development process here is genuinely complex, and testing has reportedly been ongoing to understand how a V8 configuration specifically performs with these new fuel types. Now, why a V8 specifically? This is something a lot of people are asking. Why not stick with the V6 architecture that everyone has invested billions into developing? Why not go to a V10 and really lean into the nostalgia? The answer lies in a balance of practicality, performance potential, and that sustainability story we keep coming back to. A V8 in this context offers a middle ground that a V6 and a V10 simply don't provide in the same way. It can rev higher than a V6, producing that sharper, more exciting sound profile that fans crave. But it's also more compact and manageable from an engineering standpoint than a V10, which would require an enormous amount of re-engineering across every team and manufacturer involved. There's also a commercial logic at play here. Formula One has been growing its audience at a remarkable rate over the past several years. New fans are coming in who didn't experience the V8 era firsthand. Longer-standing fans who did experience it have been vocal about missing the acoustic drama. A V8 running sustainably is almost like the perfect marketing story. It honors the sport's heritage while simultaneously pointing toward a cleaner future. You couldn't write a better narrative for Formula One to sell to the world. But let's be real with each other for a moment. This is not a done deal. This is not a confirmed regulation sitting in a signed document somewhere. What we are talking about is a serious evaluation process, a testing program, discussions at the highest levels of the sport's governance, and a framework that is still being shaped. The FIA World Motorsport Council has the authority to approve and implement these kinds of regulation changes, and the fact that V8 sustainable fuel testing is being discussed and conducted at this level is significant. But significant is not the same as final. The politics involved here are staggering. You have manufacturers who have spent mind-boggling sums of money developing their current power unit architectures. You have teams who have built entire technical philosophies around the existing hybrid systems. Any shift toward a new engine format, even one announced with a transitional timeline, sends shockwaves through the paddock. Every team principal, every technical director, every power unit partner has to immediately start calculating what this means for their competitive position, their budget allocation, their long-term planning. And then there are the manufacturers who might be attracted to Formula One by this kind of change. One of the perennial arguments for V8S, or indeed any simpler, more accessible engine format, is that it could lower the barrier to entry for new power unit suppliers. The current hybrid systems are so complicated and so expensive that only a handful of manufacturers in the world can realistically develop them to a competitive level. A well-designed V8 framework, even one with sophisticated fuel injection and sustainable fuel compatibility requirements, is a more achievable engineering target for a wider range of potential entrants. That's genuinely good for competition and for the sport's long-term health. Let me give you the tension in this story because there absolutely is one. On one side, you have the purists, both sporting and environmental, who would argue that rolling back to any kind of simpler internal combustion format is the wrong direction. That Formula One should be pushing the absolute boundaries of electrification, energy recovery, and efficiency technology. that the sport's relevance to the automotive industry of the future depends on staying at that bleeding edge of hybrid and eventually fully electric development. On the other side, you have the entertainment argument, the fan experience argument, and honestly, the commercial survival argument. Because here's an uncomfortable truth that Formula One's leadership has had to grapple with. If the racing isn't exciting, if the sound isn't thrilling, if casual viewers aren't drawn in by the spectacle, then it doesn't matter how technologically advanced the power units are. You need people watching. You need people caring. And every single piece of data from fan engagement surveys has consistently shown that sound, raw mechanical drama, and perceived simplicity all contribute massively to how much people connect with the sport. So the FIA finds itself trying to thread an almost impossibly narrow needle. Create an engine formula that is genuinely sustainable, genuinely exciting, commercially attractive to manufacturers, accessible enough to encourage new entrants, and technically relevant to the automotive world. That's not a simple brief. That's one of the most complex policy challenges in motorsport history. Now let's talk about the testing side of this because it's important. When we hear that V8 sustainable fuel testing has been part of the evaluation process, what does that actually look like in practice? These aren't just quick dyno runs. This involves extensive bench testing where engineers are measuring power output, fuel consumption, thermal efficiency, emissions characteristics, and acoustic profiles under a huge range of conditions. They're looking at how different sustainable fuel blends affect combustion behavior. They're checking component wear rates. They're modeling how these engines would perform under race conditions, including the extreme temperatures and loads that Formula One places on its hardware. The acoustic data from this testing must be fascinating. Part of what made the old naturally aspirated V8s so iconic was that very specific high-frequency wail produced by 8 cylinders firing in rapid sequence at very high revs. Whether a sustainable fuel V8 can replicate or even exceed that acoustic character depends on a huge number of variables, including the specific fuel composition, the engine's compression ratio, the rev ceiling that regulations allow, and the exhaust configuration. These are all things that would be tweaked and refined during a proper testing program. Here's something worth thinking about. The move to sustainable fuels actually creates an opportunity to potentially unlock higher rev limits than we've seen in recent years. Certain sustainable fuel compositions have different octane equivalent ratings and combustion properties that could theoretically allow engineers to safely run higher compression and higher revs. If that's true, then a sustainable fuel V8 in a future Formula One application might actually sound more extreme than the V8s of the 2006 to 2013 era. That is a possibility that should have every motorsport fan sitting forward in their seat. The timeline here matters too. The 2027 and 2028 period is being described as transitional, which means whatever decisions are made now are steps on a longer journey rather than the final destination. This gives the FIA and the teams a degree of flexibility, but it also means the uncertainty window is quite long. Teams are going to be operating in a state of partial information for a meaningful period of time, which creates its own kind of competitive complexity. Think about the strategic decisions being made right now in every major team's technical center. Do you invest heavily in understanding and developing around a potential V8 sustainable fuel architecture? Or do you treat the 2027 to 2028 period as a bridging phase and save your major development resources for whatever the post-2028 regulations look like? These are million-dollar, potentially hundreds of millions of dollars decisions being made with incomplete information. The teams with the best intelligence networks and the closest relationships with the FIA and commercial rights holders will have a significant advantage in navigating this uncertainty. Speaking of advantages, there's a fascinating sporting equity question buried in all of this. If the regulations do shift significantly toward a new engine architecture in 2027 or 2028, how do you ensure that doesn't simply hand a multi-year advantage to whichever manufacturer happens to have started development work on the new format earliest? Formula One has wrestled with this problem repeatedly throughout its history. The introduction of the V6 hybrid era in 2014 famously created a period of Mercedes dominance so complete that it stretched across multiple championships. Nobody wants a repeat of that scenario, regardless of which manufacturer is the beneficiary. The FIA's regulatory tools for managing this include things like concession systems, where teams or manufacturers who are behind can unlock additional development resources, and very careful structuring of the homologation process so that no single party has a disproportionate head start. Whether those tools will be sufficient to prevent a repeat of the 2014 dynamic depends entirely on how the specific regulations are written and enforced. And that work is happening right now. Let me bring this back to what it means for you as a fan, because ultimately that's why we are all here. The prospect of hearing V8 engines again on a Formula One grid is genuinely emotional for a lot of people. I've spoken to fans who attended their first Grand Prix in the V8 era who described the sound as something that physically moved them, that they could feel in their chest, that stayed with them for years. That kind of sensory imprinting is incredibly powerful. It creates lifelong fans. It creates people who drag their kids along and pass the passion down a generation. If the FIA and Formula One can deliver that experience while also credibly telling a story about sustainable fuels and reduced environmental impact, they will have achieved something genuinely special. Not just a technical regulation change, but a cultural moment for the sport. A moment where old fans feel validated and new fans discover something extraordinary for the first time. Of course, there are still enormous questions to answer. What exactly will the power output targets look like for a V8 sustainable fuel unit? How will the hybrid or electrical components integrate, if at all? What rev limit will be prescribed? How will the cost caps and development restrictions be structured to make this viable for everyone? These are not small questions. Each one has the potential to make or break the entire concept. What we can say with confidence is that the conversation is happening at the highest levels, that testing has been conducted, that the FIA World Motorsport Council is engaged with this topic, and that the political will to consider genuinely significant change appears to be present. Whether that political will translates into actual regulation before the 2027 season begins is the question that everyone in the paddock and every serious fan is watching very closely. My honest read on this? The sustainable fuel V8 story is real, it's being taken seriously, and the probability of seeing some form of it on the grid within the next few years is higher than it was even 12 months ago. The combination of fan demand, commercial logic, manufacturer interest, and the FIA's genuine commitment to sustainable fuel pathways creates a rare alignment of incentives that could actually push this across the finish line. But Formula One governance is notoriously complex, and history tells us that nothing is confirmed until the ink is dry on the technical regulations. We've seen promising directions get abandoned before. We've seen timelines slip. We've seen political disagreements between teams and manufacturers derail ideas that look like certainties. What I know for sure is that this story is far from over. The next 12 to 18 months are going to be absolutely critical in determining what Formula One sounds like, feels like, and means in the second half of this decade. And I will be right here covering every development as it happens. If this video gave you something to think about, if you learned something new about where Formula One is headed, then do me a favor and hit that subscribe button because this channel goes deep on stories like this every single week. Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I genuinely want to know whether you think the V8 sustainable fuel concept is the right direction for Formula One, or whether you think the sport should be heading somewhere completely different. The debate is wide open and your voice matters in it. See you in the next one. What if I told you that a tiny piece of plastic underneath a Formula One car just triggered one of the biggest political battles in modern racing history? And Ferrari might have just won. Stick with me, because this story involves secret protests, backdoor politics, a technical loophole that could be worth half a second per lap, and a governing body that may be about to drop the hammer on the reigning constructors' champions. This is the Mercedes diffuser controversy, and it is far more explosive than most people realize. Let me set the scene for you. Formula One is supposed to be the pinnacle of motorsport engineering. Every team on the grid is constantly searching for that invisible advantage, that tiny aerodynamic trick that nobody else has thought of yet. And when someone finds it, the rest of the paddock has two choices. They either copy it as fast as humanly possible, or they file a protest and try to get it banned. What we are watching right now is a story about the second option, and the team doing the protesting is one of the most storied names in the sport. Ferrari has been quietly waging war against Mercedes over a diffuser concept, and according to sources close to the situation, they may have just drawn first blood. Now, before we get into the politics, we need to understand what a diffuser actually does, because this is where the real drama lives. The diffuser is located at the rear underside of a Formula One car. Its job is to manage the airflow that travels under the car at extremely high velocity. As it rushes under the floor, it accelerates and creates a low pressure zone, which is basically what pulls the car down onto the track. This is called downforce, and downforce is everything in Formula One. More downforce means more grip, which means faster cornering speeds, which means faster lap times. The diffuser is responsible for how efficiently that air exits the underbody, and even marginal improvements in diffuser design can translate into significant performance gains. So when a team finds a new way to make their diffuser work better, it is not just an engineering curiosity. It is a competitive weapon. And that is exactly what Mercedes appeared to develop heading into this season. Their rear diffuser design caught the eye of their rivals, particularly Ferrari, who became convinced that what Mercedes had built was not just clever engineering, but a violation of the technical regulations. Here is where the story gets really interesting. Ferrari did not just walk up to Mercedes and complain. They did not even file a public protest right away. Instead, they took their concerns to the FIA, the governing body of Formula One, and they did it in a way that forced the FIA to actually examine the legality of the Mercedes concept before it became an even bigger advantage. This is classic Formula One paddock politics. You do not fight your battles in the open if you can help it. You work the system, you apply pressure through the right channels, and you wait for the technical department to come to its own conclusions. And here is the thing that should make every Mercedes fan incredibly nervous right now. The FIA appears to be moving toward banning the concept. That is not speculation. That is where the regulatory winds are blowing, based on what has been reported by people who are embedded in this story. The governing body has been reviewing the technical details, and the early indications suggest that the Mercedes diffuser may indeed be operating in a grey area that the regulations were never intended to permit. Now let me give you a moment to appreciate how significant this is. We are not talking about a protest that gets dismissed in 5 minutes. We are talking about a situation where Ferrari brought a genuine technical argument to the FIA, and the FIA is actually listening. In a sport where the biggest teams often feel like they have enough political muscle to avoid scrutiny, this represents something meaningful. If the ban goes through, it would represent a major regulatory defeat for Mercedes and potentially a turning point in the competitive order. But let me push back on myself for a second, because the story is not entirely black and white. Mercedes, to their credit, have always operated in exactly the same tradition that every other top team operates in. You find the limits of the regulations. You push right up to the edge. You make the car as fast as possible within whatever space the rules allow. If the FIA approve their design at the start of the season, which is how technical clearance normally works, then Mercedes has a legitimate argument that they built something within the rules as they understood them. The question the FIA is now wrestling with is whether the concept was ever truly compliant, or whether it slipped through a gap that should have been caught earlier. This is not the first time something like this has happened in Formula One. In fact, the sport has an incredibly rich history of exactly these kinds of controversies. Cast your mind back to the Brawn GP double diffuser story from 2009. That team, running on a shoestring budget compared to the giants of the sport, found an interpretation of the diffuser regulations that nobody else had noticed. They built a car around it, they dominated the opening races of the season, and by the time the other teams figured out what was happening and filed protests, the FIA ruled the concept legal. Brawn went on to win both championships that year. The diffuser loophole was their ticket to one of the greatest underdog stories in Formula One history. The Mercedes situation has echoes of that story, but with a potentially different outcome. The key difference is that back in 2009, the FIA ultimately ruled that the double diffuser was legal under the existing regulations. In the current case, the FIA appears to be heading in the opposite direction, and that is a very different kind of precedent to set. Let me walk you through why Ferrari specifically cares so much about this. Ferrari has been on an interesting trajectory in recent seasons. They have had flashes of genuine performance, moments where their car looked like a genuine championship contender. But they have also had moments of frustration, races where a competitor pulled away from them and the data suggested something extraordinary was happening aerodynamically. If Mercedes has been extracting meaningful performance from a diffuser concept that is not fully legal, then every lap time delta becomes tainted. Every race result becomes questionable. Ferrari has every right to be angry about that, and pursuing it through regulatory channels is the appropriate response. Beyond Ferrari, the wider paddock is watching this situation very carefully. Red Bull, McLaren, and the other teams all have engineers who understand exactly what is being discussed here. They all know the potential performance value of the contested concept, and they are all quietly wondering whether this is going to reshape the technical landscape going forward. If the FIA bans the concept mid-season, teams will need to react. Mercedes will need to rework their rear-end package. The performance hierarchy could shift. And this brings us to something really important about how Formula One actually works at the highest level. The technical regulations are a document that teams spend millions of hours and millions of dollars analyzing. Every clause, every sub-clause, every technical directive is pored over by armies of engineers and lawyers. When a grey area emerges, it is almost never because a team was being dishonest. It is because the regulations, no matter how carefully written, cannot anticipate every creative interpretation that human ingenuity might produce. The FIA knows this. The teams know this. And so these battles happen regularly, even if they do not always make headlines. What makes this particular battle notable is the identity of the players involved. Mercedes and Ferrari are not just two constructors. They are the two most iconic names in Formula One history. They are the embodiment of the rivalry between German engineering precision and Italian passion and flair. When these two organizations go to war, even in a technical committee meeting, it carries a weight that goes beyond lap times and aerodynamic components. So where does this go from here? The FIA has a few options in front of them. They can issue a technical directive that effectively bans the concept going forward, allowing Mercedes to keep their existing car but closing the door on further development of the idea. They can rule it retrospectively illegal and ask the question of whether past results should be reviewed, which would be an incredibly dramatic and controversial outcome. Or they could ultimately decide that the concept is legal and that everyone else should be free to copy it. Based on the direction things appear to be heading, that last option seems increasingly unlikely. The most probable outcome right now is a technical directive that shuts the concept down going forward. This is how the FIA tends to handle these situations when they want to close a loophole without creating chaos in the championship standings. They draw a line in the sand from a specific date and say that beyond this point, the concept is not permitted. It is a pragmatic solution that acknowledges the grey area without retroactively invalidating months of competition. For Mercedes, this would represent a significant setback. Any performance advantage they have derived from this concept would begin to erode as they are forced to develop alternative solutions. For Ferrari, it would be a validation. It would confirm that their technical team identified a genuine regulatory issue and successfully argued their case in front of the governing body. That is not nothing. In a sport where political capital matters almost as much as raw performance, successfully bringing down a competitor's advantage through regulatory channels is a meaningful victory. There is also a broader philosophical question lurking underneath all of this, and I think it is worth spending a moment on it. Formula One is caught in a perpetual tension between being a laboratory for cutting-edge automotive engineering and being a sport with a level playing field. These two goals are in fundamental conflict with each other. If you truly want the best engineers in the world to push the limits of what is possible, you have to accept that sometimes they will find things that nobody else anticipated. But if you want a fair competition where the result reflects driver skill and team strategy rather than who found the best loophole, you need tight regulations that are rigorously enforced. The diffuser controversy sits right at the intersection of these competing values. Mercedes found something clever. Ferrari decided it was too clever. The FIA is now the referee in a dispute that ultimately comes down to where you draw the line between innovation and rule bending. There is no clean answer to that question, and Formula One has been wrestling with it for as long as the sport has existed. What I find particularly fascinating about this moment is what it tells us about where the competitive balance in Formula One currently stands. The fact that Ferrari felt compelled to pursue this regulatory challenge suggests they believe the performance gap between the two teams is meaningful and that this diffuser concept is a significant contributor to it. Teams do not go through the political and diplomatic cost of challenging a rival at the FIA unless they genuinely believe the stakes justify it. Ferrari clearly believes they do. On the flip side, if Mercedes loses this battle and is forced to modify their car, we might see a quite rapid closing of whatever gap currently exists between the two teams at the top. The next few races after a potential ban would be fascinating to watch, because we would essentially be seeing a controlled experiment in how much a single aerodynamic concept can be worth in lap time. I also want to touch on something that does not get talked about enough in these controversies, which is the human element inside the engineering departments. The people who designed the Mercedes diffuser concept did not do it to break the rules. They did it because they are brilliant engineers trying to find every possible tenth of a second for their drivers. If this concept gets banned, those engineers will face the frustration of watching their work get invalidated, not because they did anything dishonest, but because the sport decided that their innovation went too far. That is a complicated thing to process, and it is a reminder that behind every technical directive and regulatory ruling, there are real people whose careers are defined by these outcomes. For the drivers, particularly those at Mercedes, this situation creates a strange kind of uncertainty. Every lap time you have set this season, every qualifying performance, every race result is now attached to a question mark. Were those results a true reflection of the team's overall package, Or were they partly inflated by a component that was not fully compliant? Even if the FIA rules going forward and does not touch past results, that question will linger in conversations for years. Look, the bottom line is this. Formula One in 2026 is more politically and technically complex than it has ever been. The introduction of new regulations always creates a gold rush for loopholes, and teams with the resources and talent to find those loopholes first gain enormous advantages. The Mercedes diffuser situation is a case study in exactly that dynamic. One team found something. Another team challenged it. The governing body is now deciding who is right. And the outcome of that decision is going to have real consequences for the championship. Ferrari appears to have won this particular battle. If the FIA ban goes through as expected, it will be a significant moment in the 2026 season narrative. It will shift momentum, it will change the engineering conversation, and it will remind every team on the grid that no advantage is safe if a rival is willing to fight hard enough to take it away. Keep watching this space, because the FIA announcement, whenever it comes, is going to be one of the most talked about regulatory moments of the season. If you want to stay on top of Formula One politics and technical developments as they happen, make sure you are subscribed and hit the notification bell because we cover all of it right here. Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Do you think the Mercedes diffuser should be banned? Is Ferrari right to push for this, or should innovation be protected? I want to hear what you think. See you in the next one. Zak Brown just said something that every Formula One fan needed to hear, and honestly, it changes how we should be thinking about McLaren's future going into the second half of this season and beyond. So let me break down exactly what's happening, why it matters more than most people are giving it credit for, and what this actually means for McLaren's championship ambitions. But first, let me set the scene for you. McLaren right now is not the same team it was 3 years ago. This is a team that went from being a midfield embarrassment to genuinely fighting for wins, fighting for podiums, and sitting right in the conversation at the very top of the constructor standings. And a huge part of that story, a part that sometimes gets overlooked when people talk about the papaya resurgence, is the engine underneath that car. The Mercedes power unit has been quietly doing serious work, and apparently Zak Brown knows it. Because here is what Brown recently made very clear. Staying with Mercedes as their engine supplier is an absolute priority for McLaren. Not a preference. Not something they are considering. An absolute priority. Those are strong words from a CEO who chooses his language carefully when he speaks publicly, and when someone in his position uses language like that, you pay attention. Now let me tell you why this is actually a fascinating story, because there are layers here that a quick headline does not capture. Let us start with the obvious question. Why would McLaren need to emphasize this so strongly? After all, McLaren and Mercedes have had an engine partnership for years now. It is not like this came out of nowhere. But the reason this statement carries so much weight right now is because of the context surrounding it. The engine regulations in Formula One are shifting. We are heading toward a new power unit era, and in that transition period, decisions being made today are going to echo through the next decade of the sport. Manufacturers are positioning themselves. Teams are making choices. And in that environment, every partnership gets reevaluated, every deal gets scrutinized, and every team has to ask itself whether its current supplier is the right long-term partner. McLaren's answer, at least according to Zak Brown, is a very loud yes when it comes to Mercedes. And if you think about the history here, that answer is not as simple as it sounds. Because McLaren and Mercedes have a complicated past. We are talking about a relationship that was once one of the most powerful in the sport, a factory partnership that produced world championships, and then a relationship that completely fell apart in one of the messiest splits in modern Formula One history. When McLaren went to Honda, it was supposed to be the beginning of a new chapter. Instead, it became 3 years of public embarrassment, a deeply unreliable car, and Fernando Alonso famously comparing his Honda engine to a GP2 car on the team radio for the entire world to hear. That Honda era was genuinely one of the lowest points for a team with one of the most decorated histories in motorsport. And coming out of that era, McLaren made what turned out to be a very smart decision. They switched to Renault, stabilized things slightly, and then eventually moved to Mercedes customer power. And since that Mercedes partnership settled in properly, the trajectory of this team has been almost exclusively upward. So when Zak Brown says Mercedes is an absolute priority, he is not just talking about engine specs and horsepower numbers. He is talking about institutional memory, about what bad power unit partnerships do to a team soul, about what 3 years of unreliability cost McLaren not just in results but in driver confidence, sponsor relationships, and internal morale. He has seen the worst-case scenario. He does not want to go back anywhere near it. But here is where it gets even more interesting, because this is not just about avoiding the past. This is about being strategic about the future. The incoming power unit regulations, which are set to transform how Formula One engines are built and how the hybrid systems work, represent probably the biggest technical reset the sport has seen in over a decade. And in a reset moment, the gaps between suppliers can widen dramatically before they narrow again. You could end up on the right side of that gap or the wrong side, and the difference between those two outcomes is the difference between fighting for championships and fighting for points. McLaren, by doubling down on Mercedes, is making a calculated bet. They are betting that Mercedes, as a manufacturer with enormous resources, deep engineering talent, and a proven track record of dominating Formula One engine development, will be one of the suppliers best positioned to navigate that transition successfully. And given that Mercedes won 8 consecutive Constructors' Championships between 2014 and 2021, that bet is not an unreasonable one to make. Now I want to talk about the competitive picture for a second, because this matters for understanding why McLaren is so eager to lock in stability right now. McLaren is genuinely in title contention. Lando Norris has become one of the fastest drivers on the grid, full stop. Not one of the promising young drivers who might become elite. One of the fastest drivers, period. And Oscar Piastri has shown the kind of consistency and racecraft that suggests McLaren has not just one elite driver but a genuine driver pairing capable of fighting for championships at both the individual and constructors level. When you have that kind of driver lineup and that kind of momentum, the last thing you want is uncertainty around your technical foundations. You do not want your engineers distracted by partnership negotiations. You do not want speculation about engine suppliers leaking into the garage culture and creating doubt. You want everyone focused on making the car faster, making the pit stops cleaner, making the strategy call sharper. Zak Brown's statement about Mercedes being an absolute priority is partly about engines and partly about sending a message internally and externally that the foundations of this team are solid. That matters more than casual observers might realize. Teams that are fighting for championships operate in a different psychological space than teams that are just trying to score points. The pressure is different, the scrutiny is different, and the way uncertainty affects performance is different. When you are fighting for a title, you cannot afford mental energy being spent on things that are not directly about making the car go faster on race weekends. Stability is a competitive advantage. Zak Brown understands that. Let me also address something that I think is genuinely worth considering, which is the alternative scenarios. What would it actually look like if McLaren decided not to make Mercedes an absolute priority? Well, the realistic alternatives are limited. Red Bull has its own engine operation now through Ford and Honda linkages, and that is very much an in-house affair. Ferrari supplies its own works team and a small number of customer teams, but getting a Ferrari engine is not straightforward for a team with McLaren's profile and ambitions. You would be a customer in a relationship where Ferrari's own team will always come first, which creates an inherent competitive conflict of interest. Then there is the theoretical scenario of being a works partner with a manufacturer that enters Formula One as part of the new regulations. There has been speculation over the years about various manufacturers considering entries, and the incoming rules were designed partly to make that more attractive. But that path involves enormous uncertainty and a long development runway before you see competitive results. McLaren has been there before with Honda. They know the risks. The risk-reward calculation on going down that road again would need to be extraordinarily compelling to make sense, and right now, with the team actually competing for wins, it simply is not. So the Mercedes relationship is not just the preferred option, it is genuinely the most strategically sound option given McLaren's current position and ambitions. Brown saying it is an absolute priority is him being honest about a conclusion that the logic of the situation actually supports. Now I want to zoom out a little bit and think about what this means for the broader Formula One ecosystem, because there is a wider story here that connects to how the sport is evolving. Formula One in 2026 is going to look different from Formula One today. The new power unit regulations bring significant changes to the balance between the internal combustion elements and the electrical components. The electrical deployment is going to be substantially higher, which means the software, the energy management systems, and the hybrid architecture become even more critical to lap time performance than they already are. Getting that right requires the kind of deep institutional knowledge and development resource that only a manufacturer of Mercedes scale can bring to the table. For a customer team like McLaren, Being aligned with a manufacturer that has the engineering depth to master those systems quickly at the start of the new era could be genuinely decisive. The first year or two under new regulations often produce results that persist longer than they should because teams build car concepts around their power unit characteristics. If you get a great engine on day one of the new era, your car development starts from a stronger baseline and the advantages can compound. That is the prize that Zak Brown is protecting when he talks about Mercedes being an absolute priority. He is not just talking about next season. He is talking about positioning McLaren correctly for the regulatory reset, which could define the competitive order of Formula One for years. And I think that strategic clarity is actually one of the underrated qualities of McLaren's recent renaissance. Because it is easy to look at the results and see the papaya cars winning races and say, oh, they just got their car development right, they hired good people, things fell into place. But there is a consistent strategic coherence behind the scenes that is easy to overlook, and Zak Brown's management philosophy has been central to that. Brown came in when McLaren was genuinely broken as an organization. There were political fights, budget issues, personnel instability, and a team culture that had lost its identity. The rebuilding process was slow and painful and very public in its ugliness. But the team that exists now reflects decisions made several years ago about culture, about investment priorities, about driver development, and about technical partnerships. The Mercedes engine commitment is part of that same strategic coherence. Let us also just spend a moment on what this means from a fan perspective, because ultimately Formula One is entertainment and drama and storylines, and the McLaren versus Ferrari battle of the last season and a half has been genuinely fantastic viewing. Having McLaren as a real competitor at the front of the grid makes the sport better. Full stop. The more teams that can genuinely fight for wins on merit, the more unpredictable and exciting the racing becomes. When McLaren is strong, Lando Norris is in the mix for wins, and Norris has a natural charisma and racing style that makes him one of the most compelling figures in the sport right now. Piastri, meanwhile, is the kind of quietly devastating talent that grows on you slowly, and then suddenly you realize you are watching someone who might be one of the best of his generation. Keeping that competitive structure intact by maintaining a strong engine partnership is not just good for McLaren. It is good for the sport. And Zak Brown, who is fundamentally a commercial and marketing mind as much as he is a team operator, absolutely understands that narrative value. So where does this leave us heading toward the rest of the 2026 season and beyond? McLaren is in a position where they have championship winning potential in both the drivers' and constructors' standings. They have a driver pairing that most teams would give significant amounts of money to have. They have rebuilt their culture, their infrastructure, their technical operation. They have the working factory upgrades that have been in progress. And they have an engine partnership that their CEO is calling an absolute priority to maintain. The question for McLaren is not whether they have the ingredients to compete for a title. They clearly do. The question is whether they can execute consistently across a full season, whether they can manage the internal dynamics of having two fast drivers who both want to win, and whether the car development rate continues to match or exceed their rivals. The Mercedes engine confirmation removes one potential question mark. It gives the team a foundation of certainty to build on. And in a sport where uncertainty is everywhere and advantages are measured in thousandths of a second, having that kind of foundational certainty genuinely matters. Zak Brown's statement was brief and to the point, but it carries layers of strategic meaning when you unpack it properly. This is a man who has rebuilt one of Formula One's great teams, who has seen the catastrophic consequences of getting an engine partnership wrong, and who is now in a position of genuine strength looking to protect and extend that strength into the next regulatory era. Keeping Mercedes as an absolute priority is the smart call. It is the logical call. And judging by the results McLaren has been producing lately, the people making the calls at that team have earned a significant amount of trust. If you are a McLaren fan watching this, or honestly just a Formula One fan who appreciates seeing real competition at the front of the grid, this is good news. The foundations look solid. The direction looks clear. And with Norris and Piastri in those papaya cars with a competitive Mercedes engine underneath them heading into what could be the most significant regulatory change in a generation, McLaren looks like a team built to fight. Now whether they actually win the championship this season and in the seasons to come, well, that is what the racing is for. But the strategic pieces are absolutely there. And sometimes, in Formula One, getting the strategy right off the track is just as important as getting it right on it. Drop your thoughts in the comments. Do you think Mercedes is the right long-term partner for McLaren? Or do you see a scenario where another option makes sense? And if you are not subscribed yet, what are you doing? We talk Formula One like this every single week right here.